Welcome to This Week in Local, a Locology podcast featuring lively conversations about the local digital ecosystem, hosted by Locology analysts Mike Bolin and Charles Laughlin.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to This Week in Local. I'm Charles Laughlin, Senior Analyst at Locology. Today, I'm joined by James Morse, who's the SVP of Product at BrandMuscle. James, how's it going?
Good, Charles. Thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure. So, what we want to do today is we want to talk about what you do at BrandMuscle, which is, your lead product, of course. And you were at our L24 conference recently in Texas back in April, which feels like a long time ago, particularly long ago. And you gave this talk, which preceded a panel on sort of the history of Prohibition, which I just loved because I love that kind of thing. And we don't want to repeat the history of Prohibition here, though I'm sure if anyone wants that conversation, they can call you and get a very cogent and entertaining history of Prohibition. But what that triggered in my mind was this idea of what level of knowledge and understanding, et cetera, do you need to own a category? And you have kind of a market dominance, correct me at any point, in the beverage and alcohol category. If that's fair, stop me. But that's the sense we have. So we want to get into sort of what does it take to have that level of dominance in a category. But before we get there, and before we rehash the history of Prohibition, why don't you tell us a little bit quickly about you, where you come from, kind of what led you into the product, profession, I guess. And before that, just, the match test description of BrandMuscle.
Yeah, so BrandMuscle works with companies that have really a national presence at the local level. So our big thing is local. So we service really two sides of a business. If you think of Fortune 1000, so non-beverage alcohol, and then beverage alcohol. So anywhere where you sell through a channel, typically at that local level, we help empower that local entity to do marketing that is brand and legal and fiduciary compliant at all steps of the way.
So these are beverage brands for the most part?
Yeah, so on the beverage alcohol side, it's going to be, we work with the suppliers, so the manufacturers of the alcohol, the distributors, so kind of the wholesalers, but a little bit different in nuanced ways. And then even the local levels. So think of that as where you buy and sometimes consume alcohol. So a grocery store or a liquor store, or even a bar or restaurant where you're going to go on premise and actually consume that alcohol.
Okay. Fortune 1000 seems incredibly broad.
Very broad.
Incredibly specific. Is there anything to why those two?
The difference was, so BrandMuscle is an amalgamation of a few companies just through mergers and acquisitions. One was Centiv out of Chicago, which really specialized in the beverage alcohol industry, specifically with print. Mm-hmm. So if you walk into a bar or restaurant, or you pick up and you've got one of those nice menu books, 9 times out of 10, we produce the menu books and the menus and point of sale marketing. So we help the brands make sure that all of it's compliant, but then we also help specifically on the beverage alcohol side heavily with the execution of that. Mm-hmm. And if you think of any liquor store that you've been into, you can think of really interesting point of sale displays. You might see a surfboard or something that's holding a ton of little tiny airplane bottles of alcohol. We've likely actually created that design and then produced it because they want to be more unique. Our insurance agents on the Fortune 1000 side, they're all producing the same types of content most of the time. They're just switching out their headshot and their name. But the beverage alcohol industry gets very competitive in unique ways.
Still do a lot of calendars. I mean, I kind of feel like that's
a lot of calendars.
Whereas bev alcohol, there may be some calendars involved, but I feel like what you're getting at is the level of creativity involved is much higher. Not to diss on insurance.
Right. I think what's interesting about beverage alcohol is the suppliers, so the manufacturers of that alcohol, they don't mind as much how you use their assets. They obviously want you to use them in specific ways because they've taken a lot of time crafting their brand messaging and everything. But at the end of the day, when you're the distributor or the bar or the liquor store, you're marketing for multiple brands at once. So whatever the suppliers created kind of goes out the window. You're just taking their brand assets and combining them with other competitive brands. And so that's where it is a little bit more creative because you're having to take in all of these brand guidelines and still create something that really represents your local business. We use Tito's as an example, a great brand, great client, but at the end of the day, Tito's doesn't have Charles's local bar. They don't own that piece. Prior to Prohibition, they would have, but they don't now. So Charles's bar has to be unique to get customers to come in the door and ultimately to sell Tito's, but also other brands, because they want to make sure that they meet the customer's need and the customer's not just coming in for Tito's all the time.
Yeah, I want to get into the mechanics of alcohol marketing in a bit because I think there's a lot of interesting components there.
Yeah.
But you just said something that I want to tie back to what you said at the conference, which is that you don't own the bar. The Tito's doesn't own the bar. At one point, Tito's would have, correct? Or maybe something like that, right?
Correct. There was a time, it's really what led to Prohibition, is that the suppliers owned that bar. And if you think an era that's good is thinking about like the 1850s, the gold rush. And during the gold rush, you would have just you had these pocket communities, and you would have a supplier of alcohol. And they would own the bar or the liquor, wherever you were going to the bar. You were buying and consuming there or taking it home, and they owned that. And this led to what we call the temperance movement, which their aim was to reduce that consumption of alcohol because they believed that it led to moral, health, social concerns. And so that's what led us to Prohibition. And when Prohibition was repealed, then that's what the government came in and said, look, we're going to put alcohol back. We understand that people want to drink and consume alcohol, but we're going to separate these two things. We're going to make sure that the supplier is not selling directly to the consumer.
Okay. So that was seen as a way of controlling consumption.
It was a way of controlling consumption. And then I think I made this joke even at the conference, it was also just another way to tax the hell out of them. They wanted more tax dollars, so it gave them an additional point to tax.
Ostensibly to control consumption, but really to create more.
There's always the underlying tax opportunity when you look at the federal government.
Right, and they rarely are repealed, right?
Right.
Repealed, but the tax isn't, right?
Yes.
So that's all super fascinating, but I think where that kind of the reason for that talk was you were kind of describing how we got to the current situation, right? And that is the environment you operate in. But what I'm super curious about is, what does it take? And let's talk about this question in the context of bev alcohol, or however you refer to it. What does it take to own a category? What do you have to know? What's the level of understanding of the industry required? Just want to kind of walk us through the mechanics of what it takes to really own a category.
I mean, the beverage alcohol category in general is tough. This 3-tier system, in a lot of ways, reflects how other manufacturing systems work, where you have a manufacturer, a distributor, and a dealer, that type of 3-tier. But overall, beverage alcohol is somewhat incestuous in nature. You see people move quite a bit through the different organizations that fall into this, but
on that point, isn't it also incestuous with? There's only a couple companies own most of these, right?
So you're right. Especially lately, there's been a lot of consolidation in this space, and we're starting to see changes. Certainly, where there's an old club to it, and we're starting to see a McKinsey-like organization start to enter the industry. But at the end of the day, to kind of own a category, especially for beverage alcohol, you have to touch all 3 of those tiers to really be able to support at the local level, which is, ultimately what we're talking about in a lot of ways, is that you can't just own Charles's bar in this example, that local entity that may be in, I don't know, Cincinnati, Ohio, wherever we want to place Charles's bar. But you really do have to own the category, because at the end of the day, Charles, nor the distributor, nor the supplier, none of them own all points of the supply chain or all points of the marketing chain. Is that you have to be able to be very well integrated into all 3 areas and be able to support all 3 functions along that path to purchase, if you think of it from a consumer perspective.
Could you walk us through how that works in this category, how you work with each? Now, you say the 3-tier system, that's manufacturer, distributor, and I guess the liquor store or the restaurant, which is the end point.
That's right. You nailed it, Charles. So if you think about The supplier. So let's start there. They're supplying the alcohol. When they create the alcohol itself, they create the brand assets. And these can be just a multitude of things. It can be the bottle shot imagery. It can be tasting notes, a wine score if it's wine. It's going to be cocktail recipes. So we were lucky we had Sly there during the panel.
Right.
Sly's a mixologist, even the distributor, but
I
the
wanted
suppliers
to
also.
see with Sly, but it just didn't happen. So
That's great. Sly's great. If you're ever in the Dallas region, definitely hit her up.
yeah.
But see, the supplier creates their own cocktails with it. And then they supply those assets downward to ultimately BrandMuscle in this scenario. The distributors get access to it too, but they want all of those assets to print the collateral that's needed. And again, that could be POS. A lot of times it's menus. I mean, it's the most common piece of marketing that we actually as consumers interface with when it comes to beverage and alcohol is going into a restaurant and seeing a signature cocktail menu or a wine list. Those are all marketing tactics as far as these companies are concerned. They hand those over. The distributor then wants access to those. So sometimes they're dealing with a supplier's digital asset manager, but most of the times you've got these sales reps at the distributor. And these sales reps are like anyone who's typically younger in their career, high attrition within the distributor sales reps. And the sales reps are the ones interfacing with the bars and restaurants and liquor stores. They want to sell cases of alcohol into those accounts.
All right.
So when what they're doing is they're helping the bar, restaurant, liquor store do more with their marketing. Hey, if you buy 30 cases of X alcohol, X wine or spirits, then I'll cover your menus in these items. And then what's interesting actually is that the distributor then charges that back to the supplier. So every time a brand is mentioned, and they have contracts and negotiated rates, but every time a brand is mentioned, they can bill that back to the supplier. So most of the time, the distributors aren't even necessarily paying anything to create that collateral, but it keeps that separation between the supplier, away from the supplier, and the local entity where you and I consume alcohol from at the end of the day. So there are all of these points. And a lot of times there's duplicative efforts between the supplier and the distributor. And you'll feel tension between those two entities a lot of times, right? Like, especially now, the suppliers, you see this a lot of times in Congress. They're going and lobbying where, do we really need the distributors? And the answer is yes. Yes, absolutely you do. But that 3-tier system, there's marketing every step of the way. Supplier wants, we'll keep using Tito's, they're single brand, they work well. They want Tito's to be reflected in the right way. The distributor may be selling Tito's in absolute. So they may just be doing a vodka tasting night. So I'm going to put multiple on there. And then Charles's Bar wants to make sure that Charles's Bar and logos all there, contact information is there to drive you there. Or even if it's their menu, that their branding is there at the very top of the menu. So all three of those are working very closely together, but also very disparately at the same time to make sure that that's conveyed.
So I'm going to throw one example that I noticed at you and tell me who makes this happen. So, go out to a restaurant, there's the signature cocktails, and they'll give you the ingredients, and they're often the brand name of the ingredient. This kind of vodka, this kind of cordial, or whatever goes into it. Maybe the restaurant's recipe, maybe a recipe others provided to them. I don't really know. I mean, Cosmo, everyone knows that's a classic cocktail, but the new ones, who makes that happen? How does that part of it? Because I imagine that's where a lot of sales are made in a way.
Biggest case sales are along signature cocktails. You see a direct correlation between when a signature cocktail, to your point, has a brand listed on it and the increased case sales at that location. But that can happen a lot of different ways. So again, the suppliers creating their own recipes, they want to disseminate down. Then you have people like Sly and her team at the distributors. So Sly's with RNDC specifically, but they'll have their own mixologists. And a lot of the suppliers are vying for them to taste their alcohol and to ultimately want to put them into signature cocktails. I think a lot of times at least with me, when I think of suppliers of alcohol, it's the big brands. It's the ones that we've heard of that have been established for decades and decades. But actually, there's a huge long tail of small suppliers that are trying to enter this space. They want to get acquired. I assume at the end of the day, we see so much consumption there, but they're also vying for the interest of those mixologists at the distributor, because they may not even have their own staff. They may be running a shop of 3 or 4 people at most. So they're just trying to get the distributor, hey, here's my product. Please highlight my product. Please sell my product in your markets, whatever you can do. So you've got a cross between the supplier and the distributor. And then ultimately that sales rep is bridging the gap at the distributor with that account. An account could be, again, Charles's bar, but it could also be a large account like Disney World, for example, where they're working at a much higher scale, larger scale there, and crafting cocktails very specific to them. So it's really across the board, but the distributor is interesting because they do a lot of the market research. So they're going to know what products are working well in certain areas. So if Charles's bar is in Cincinnati and James's bar is in Cleveland, Ohio, there could be a difference in really trends that are happening there. And they're following those trends and helping the bar, restaurant, liquor store understand those so that they craft a menu that's ultimately going to get more cocktails sold.
So if I go to a restaurant, should I just assume that the recipes for cocktails are coming from the distributor rather than from the restaurant itself?
It could be. There's also, one of the things we're working on is an AI tool for mixologists, knowing that these sales reps don't always have the bandwidth with their distributor to go in and do those sorts of things. So again, Charles's bar might fall well below the need versus a Disney World. So giving them tools, but a lot of times, yes, those are created by the distributor. Or if the bar restaurant's large enough or lucky enough, they'll have a mixologist on staff who's also partnering with the distributor from a marketing perspective to make sure the data is being fed into them. And they know their clientele well enough usually. You know who's sidling up at the bar and what they're looking for to create those sorts of things as well.
Right. Yeah, that's fair. So BrandMuscle got into Bev alcohol just through acquisition. You sort of landed in it, or
Yeah, Cintiv out of Chicago was heavy there and had been since around 2000. Cintiv and BrandMuscle were both founded around 2000. And then through that acquisition and merger, they had a print shop, obviously doing a lot of print. And then the BrandMuscle side had much more of the other industries, financial services and manufacturing primarily, that really married well together.
Okay. So you're a product guy. You mentioned the AI tool for mixologists, which is, I think, just so inevitable. But as a product person, talk about how you build product to keep a category like this in the fold under your, I hate to say it this way, under your control, brand dominance or category dominance, excuse me. Kind of talk about that a little. How you build product to own a category like you do.
We stay very close with both the suppliers and the distributors. And luckily, the distributors usually have a portfolio of certain suppliers. And we lucked out with the timing, at least Cintiv did, I should say, at the timing of getting top suppliers and distributors. Once you kind of get them all together, it just works in a very synergistic way. And I hate using that word, but you know what I mean there is that they have to work together. The government says you have to do it this way. But as far as a product perspective goes, I mean, we keep local in mind. That's our biggest piece. I mean, the Charles's bar, those liquor stores, restaurants, those aren't our primary audience. Those aren't our primary buyers. It is the suppliers and the distributors. Large multi-location bars and restaurants can be clients as well, but primarily it's the suppliers and distributors. But we still keep local at the forefront of what we're doing because we need to make sure that we're enabling local to market and sell the products that we're giving them. So we do work closely with the distributors, and then we work that up the chain and make sure that we're validating against suppliers. The hardest part is making sure that we balance the friction between those two entities and the priorities that come there. But we do keep the local piece in mind. So how are they trying to market locally? Where do they see opportunities locally to be successful? And what data can we give them? It's a very data-driven industry, as you can imagine. Where are their brands listed on menus versus other brands and anonymizing that? But how can we make them more strategic? That's ultimately what we're trying to do, and that's what we keep at the forefront.
The data that they're using to make these decisions, are you the source? I mean, are you the one aggregating and providing them with that data to some degree, at least?
Yeah, we have a head of beverage alcohol internally who actually comes from the space. He came from RNDC previously. So his team and my team partner closely together to, yes, aggregate the data, those insights, pass those back along, but also validate directions we're going. The mixology AI tool is a direct feedback from the distributors that we were hearing of. Mixology teams were being downsized. And how could we still support the needs of the local bar and restaurant to be able to create signature cocktail menus and signature cocktails specifically for them? And how do we help them with photography? Generative AI does a lot of those things now.
Yeah.
So there are a lot of just the feedback loops that we hear from these clients, but we also try to make sure that they're keeping the local aspect in mind as much as possible.
Now, when the endless conversation about what will AI disrupt, what professions, and mixologist was not my first my first choice, or the first one that came to mind. But you never know, right?
Never know.
Yeah, you never do know. So you've mentioned the tension between distributors and manufacturers, I guess, for lack of a better. I guess alcohol's manufactured as much as anything else is.
Yep.
I'm going to put you on the spot and ask you to make a prediction of where that ultimately goes. That tension that you were describing.
I think it stays there. I think that the United States government, the federal government's not going to change this anytime soon. We've seen people trying to press. We saw Costco press for a while with their Kirkland wine, saying, "Look, I'm a supplier and a distributor both. Let's bridge this."
Isn't that just a private label situation?
Yeah, it is a private label situation. That's right. But they're saying, like, we have the capacity. We can do both of these things. And they were pushed back on ultimately.
Were they the loudest voices here, or is that a common thing you hear across the board?
It's they were the loudest voices. I mean, you sometimes hear it, right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. But ultimately, at the end of the day, I don't see the 3-tier system going away anytime soon. And the tension's healthy. It's very much both sides want the best for themselves, right? We're all looking out for number one in that situation. Mm-hmm. But at the end of the day, the friction between those two ultimately brings the best value to the local entity who's selling and the consumer, in my mind.
Okay.
So I think we'll see a lot of change in the next few years, especially as we see more of what I call the McKinsey crowd entering this space.
I want to clarify what that really means, because when you say the McKinsey crowd, I'm imagining 22-year-old recently minted MBAs in blue suits. But what are you really talking about when you say that?
I mean, that's pretty much it, but I would age them a little bit, is what I'm saying, is that we're having, the beverage alcohol space for a long time. I mean, you see some of the large distributors are family-owned businesses still to this day, and we're talking about multi-billion-dollar companies, large companies. They've been run by family organizations, and there's nothing wrong with that at all. But again, you saw the incestuousness of this industry, and we're starting to see some change. We're seeing more external consultants come in and start to take positions there. And again, I don't think that's good or bad necessarily. I think it's just change. So it's too early to tell to see how that.
So I guess what I would, and this may be a bad comparison, but one of the things that was talked about a lot at the conference, at least around certain categories, was, private equity is coming in and rolling up all these. But that doesn't just consolidate. It also brings a different mentality to how the businesses are run, right? So is that really what you're talking about?
Correct. I think there's a change management on the operational side that'll happen. I don't know. I mean, it'll probably happen all throughout. We'll see different points. I think we're just going to see a change in how these operate together, but I don't think we'll see a change in the friction necessarily. And again, I think it's healthy friction between these. But yeah, that's what I mean by the McKinsey crowd to me is just external consultants who are very intelligent individuals,
right,
coming in and starting to change a little bit of how this has operated for the past couple of decades.
But they're not industry people. They're not people who have a
correct
for that industry. They care about whatever their assignment is that week, or that month or whatever it is.
Correct. And we started seeing this in the tech space on this side first. You'd have like a CTO who'd been in the beverage alcohol industry for decades. And now we're starting to see CTOs that are new to beverage alcohol, but are experts in technology and how to build software tools, et cetera. We're starting to see that overlap a little bit more into those other leadership positions. So, I mean, we'll continue to see consolidation on the supplier manufacturer side. There's no doubt. There's too much of a long tail.
Just quickly back to this CTO who's no longer the Bev veteran, but is from a SaaS company, whatever it is. What changes will we see as consumers, as restaurant goers, or whatever, if any, as a result of this transition you're talking about?
I don't think as consumers we'll see anything necessarily. I think the local entities will. These distributors are going to start focusing more on them and how to build loyalty with them and give them more things. I mean, they've been giving them marketing and menu solutions for a while, but I think we'll see expansion there. I mean, you could say that goes into point of sale software. There's tons of options there, but I think they'll start giving them better tools to run their business than they have in the past.
Okay. You mentioned that the federal government set up the 3-tiered system and federal regulation, but my impression is that this industry, and specifically, is very locally regulated. Is that fair?
Very locally regulated.
How do you manage around that? And that's very unique to this industry.
It is. It's painful in a lot of ways. It's very much market driven. Markets are typically states. You'll see some states with multiple markets like New York, California, that sort of thing.
Right. And
it's very state regulated. And so we joke a lot of times you could have one distributor client, our account team could have one distributor client, but in all actuality, they may have 35 because that distributor's in 35 different markets. That's where it becomes cumbersome and difficult to manage. From a compliance standpoint, that's where AI comes in. You have to automate those types of rules that have been in either people's head or well documented to do that. Because with BrandMuscle, we do about 200,000 custom designs for bars and restaurants and liquor stores a year.
Yeah.
So a lot of that's managed through people, but how to automate that. But it is difficult. And, I even joke about some counties could be different where you have, dry counties and how to navigate those, or versus you have them as clubs. There's a local Chili's. This is a while ago, so it may not be the case anymore, but I'm from Arkansas originally. So there's a local Chili's in Arkansas in a dry county. But to go into the Chili's, you had to sign up for a membership. You had to be part of the Chili's club. And it was their way to sell alcohol and still smoke in the establishment, mind you. So this has been a while. But
a while ago. Yeah.
There's little things like that they get around.
Okay. So what was coming into my head around this theme of how to own a category, understanding that level of complexity, regulatory complexity, seems to be a way to differentiate and sort of build a fence around what you do, right?
100%. Yeah. Because you can learn the brand's guidelines, no problem. You could just be a Tito's expert, no problem. But to then manage it within those individual markets, what's allowed, what are they allowed to say? I'm in Cleveland, so are they allowed to partner with the Cleveland Browns and put things with the Cleveland Browns? No, not unless that's a trademark violation, not unless you have a partnership with them. So there's a lot of those intricacies in understanding what the supplier is allowed to do, what the distributor is allowed to do in their markets, and then what the local businesses are allowed to do as well within their markets. That becomes very complex.
Okay. Final question, because we're getting short on time. Yeah. If you were to think of, not unique to this category, but just broadly speaking, a couple of things you would offer to someone else who says, we want to do it. We have we have customers in category Y, and we want to dominate category Y. What do you think are a couple of things that an agency, let's just say, has to think about doing or has to have nailed down in order to achieve that goal?
I think there are 2 points there. I think the first is everything's compliant now. It doesn't matter what industry you're working with. So I think understanding the intricacies of that is absolutely important, especially from an agency perspective. This is where agencies get their hand slapped quite a bit. Mm-hmm. I think the other side of it is truly looking at all points of that customer journey. We get lost a lot of times in our own. You may have just an organic social company. They're only thinking about that touch point for the consumer. But if you really want to dominate a category, I think you really have to put your mindset in the consumer's mindset. Where all are they touching and exploring that product, that service, whatever it may be? And then really hitting on each of those different points to dominate a category to make sure that they don't go anywhere. And we've seen a couple of companies really successful about this, even in point solutions. Like Hearsay's done a really good job in organic social because they built in the compliance rules for financial services and they understood exactly where they wanted the insurance agent to play socially. They thought about that. Where am I engaging with social? So just understanding those different touch points is very important, and we'll make sure that you sort of kind of put a moat around you so that competitors can't enter that space as easily.
Great. James, it's been a lot of fun talking to you. Thank you for joining us today.
Oh my gosh, always a pleasure. Thank you so much.
All right, great. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of This Week in Local. I'm Charles Laughlin. Our producer is Dara Sweat, and my co-host is Mike Bolin. Thanks to today's guest, James Morse of BrandMuscle. You can find This Week in Local on all major podcast networks, and you can learn more at locology.com. Please write to us at podcast@locology.com to ask questions, recommend guests, and inquire about sponsoring this show. And please subscribe, rate, and review this podcast. Your engagement helps others find us. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.
Thank you for tuning in to this week's episode of Locology's This Week in Local with Mike Bolin and Charles Laughlin. Be sure to subscribe for more.